Hi, I'm Talia Baroncelli, and you're watching theAnalysis-news. Joining me in a bit is Frank Hammer, who is the former president and chairman of the UAW Local 909 in Detroit. We'll be speaking about the UAW strike and twists and turns in the strategy of this really historic stand-up strike. But before we get to it would be great if you could go to our website, theAnalysis.news, and give a small donation if you can by hitting the donate button at the top right corner of the screen. You can also get onto our mailing list. That way you're updated every time a new episode is released. And subscribe and like our podcasts on whichever platform you watch the show on, as well as on YouTube, The Analysis-news. See you in a bit with Frank Hammer. Joining me now is Frank Hammer. He's the former president and chairman of the United Auto Workers Local 909, which is located at the GM Transmissions plant in Detroit. He's a former GM worker and worked for GM for 32 years. So it's really great to have you today, Frank.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Well, last week on September 15th, we saw 12,700 United Auto Workers participate in a stand-up strike. They walked out at plants in Toledo, Ohio, Wayne, Michigan, and Wentzville, Missouri. And today, Shawn Fain, who is the current president of the UAW, announced that there would be an additional 38 strikes at plants across 20 different states. So why don't we speak about the historic strategy that's being employed by having these targeted strikes, but first, I think it's important to discuss what's really at stake here, what the UAW is calling for, and whether you think the big three automakers, GM, Ford, and Stellantis, will meet the workers' demands.
So just to clarify, this is, I think it's got the whole UAW membership and way beyond, very excited. It's not 38 plants, it's 38 parts distribution centers or parts distribution warehouses. And the difference is, of course, that there's no production in those facilities by and large. And this is where, like I said, it's parts distribution. So it's more like a logistics warehouse, but it's very key to the distribution of parts throughout the whole system. And this is at GM, this is at Stellantis, this is currently not at Ford because Shawn Fain reported that there was progress at the negotiating table with Ford.
That's correct. So what do you think we can expect right now from the ongoing negotiations between UAW, Ford, Stellantis, and GM?
Well, I think what's really striking to me, and I've been now in the labor movement for 50 years, is that the UAW is really had the upper hand in these negotiations, and certainly the upper hand in terms of its media and the message. And I think that this has gotten these three big, large mega corporations set back on their feet because they are not knowing how to cope and deal with this. Never mind the media strategy, the strategy of actually taking out plants in all three companies and taking them out in this measured, selective way, keeping the companies guessing, is really quite profound. And I don't think the companies have found themselves in this situation in decades, and they're grasping to figure out what to do. And I think that's a good place for the UAW to be in. It's having an impact not only on the UAWD, but on beyond. Many workers in the UAW has said we're fighting for the whole working class.
Well, why do you think Shawn Fain decided to use this stand-up tactic? Is it because it's really taking the big three off guard, or, it has like this surprise element where they don't really know what to expect and which distribution centers or plants are going to go on strike? Is it trying to recreate maybe the sit-down strikes from 1937?
So Shawn Fain has certainly compared this tactic of the strategy now to the workers' struggle to win union recognition in the 30s. Of course, then they were sit-ins, and these today are stand-ups. but they tried to be strategic as they were in the Flint sit-downs, striking and occupying and sitting in on an engine plant, paralyzed General Motors, which at that time was the largest company in the world and very anti-union. And it forced GM to recognize the UAW. We're in that kind of moment, I think, is what Sean Fain is communicating. And I think that they're taking a measured approach. Don't want to deplete the strike fund, want to give the companies opportunity to change their ways and come across with proposals that UAW can accept. So, and I think that my take is that a majority of workers are really enthusiastic about the approach that he has taken.
I think a lot of people realize how important this strike is, and they see, the connections between the cause and the purpose of this strike and how it's tied to the labor movement in general. So I get the sense that a lot of people are really supporting the UAW here. And, what are the core issues that the UAW is pressing on? Like, my interpretation is that the main issues are, getting rid of the tiered system. So some workers, they start working at, I don't know, $15 an hour, and they have to work 20 years before they can make it to the top, before they can earn more money and get benefits. And some don't even have COLA, so the cost of living allowances. What else is at stake here? What else? What is the platform of the UAW right now?
Well, I think that you're emphasizing certainly one of the very core demands that the UAW has put to the big three. And this matter of tiers, this matter of workers occupying different castes, it's a caste system within the companies. And this is what workers have been forced to grapple with. It began in 2003 when after the GM and Ford and Stellantis all shed their parts operations into standalone companies like Visteon and Delphi, that they came back and negotiated a whole new tier at those companies for workers who had not yet even been hired. And we went fast forward in 2007. They began to institute that at the big three. And I can tell you I know what the argument was then, and I think it's important for people to know. The companies told the UAW, we're either going to outsource all this work to non-union plants, and you can decide to try to organize them, or we'll keep them in-house. You'll still get your dues. You'll be able to represent them, but they're going to come in at a lower wage with lower benefits. And the UAW unfortunately agreed. And then this was locked in during the bailout. And what we have today are 4 or 5 tiers. You have the temps or supplemental workers. You have the new hires that, like you talked about, the progression. They often had to go 8 years to make their ultimate wage. You have subcontractors, wholly initiated by GM. GM has the subsystems. They have a separate contract, lower wages. And by the way, not one worker at the big three has COLA, not even the legacy workers. That was suspended during the bailout. And the term suspended, I guess, was used very loosely because here we are, 13 years later, and we don't have COLA. And that's for everybody, including retirees, by the way. But we don't have it for any active worker. So you touched on, I think, one of the most heartfelt issues that has to be done away with. And workers have to enjoy the right of equal pay for equal work, which is embedded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that the U.S. government is a signatory to.
Well, let's give some more context to the bailouts in 2008. I remember at the time it was a huge deal. The U.S. government was bailing out the big three, and I think the bailouts both in the U.S. and in Canada amounted to something like $85 billion U.S. dollars across the auto industry. So it was a lot of money. And at the time, the big three were saying that they needed this money so that they could ensure that people would still have jobs. They obviously cut a lot of those jobs, but that some people would still be able to hold on to their jobs. And I think, at the time, these, getting rid of COLA and instituting or continuing this tiered system, was it presented as a temporary measure, or was it presented as, the gravy train is over, you're going to have to deal with this for the next few decades?
So it was the farmer. The common understanding, which has been actually repeated over and over in various kinds of media, even in alternative media, is that this was a temporary setback for auto workers, that in the goodness of their hearts, they sacrificed. And now that the companies are back on their feet, we're back to get ours, which we gave up. And that is unfortunately a myth. It was not about making promises to return what was given. It was an actual restructuring. I mean, the czar of the auto restructuring committee that was set up under Obama, the book that he wrote is Overhaul. It's called Overhaul. And it was meant as a permanent restructuring of auto. And it really was in line with what Naomi Klein has written about so eloquently, about something called the shock doctrine or disaster capitalism. And this was probably one of the prime examples of, here we have this bankruptcy, the market falls out from 17 million cars all of a sudden to 10 million, and we have a shock to the system. And Wall Street and the auto companies seize the moment and says, we can take advantage of this and lower and restructure what auto workers are going to get compensated going forward. And they did a hell of a job. And this was under George Bush, and this was under Barack Obama, and by the way, with Biden as well.
But did this also accelerate the offshoring of a lot of these manufacturing jobs, or was that already underway, I guess, from the early 2000s?
So the offshoring of jobs, I can tell you there have been different places along the way where offshoring has been salient, but it goes back to the 70s. It goes back to the 80s. It goes back to the 90s with NAFTA. It goes back to 2005. I remember being in a room when General Motors announced that if you're a supplier and you're not based in China, we're not doing business with you. So the offshoring has been this constant stream of threats and loss to the U.S. Auto workers, and the bailout didn't stop the offshoring. It went on and it went on, and we have today in negotiations Stellantis going out and saying, if you keep this up, we're going to send more truck manufacturing to Mexico. So it's been constant. The bailout, you would think, okay, workers made all these sacrifices. Good, we'll keep more jobs. Didn't happen.
That's interesting that you point out that this is also, a bit of misinformation even in the alternative media, because that's definitely something that I've heard is that, during the bailout, workers made those concessions thinking, this is just a temporary measure. We'll have to give up COLA and we'll have to live with these cuts, but eventually they'll be reinstated. So that's very interesting that at the time it was, basically a restructuring in accordance with what had been instituted previously in post-Fordist models, where work was getting even more precarious and people weren't able to rely on benefits. So that's really fascinating. And that kind of takes me to additional, I would say propaganda almost, when you listen to the CEOs of some of these companies, such as Jim Farley, who's the CEO of Ford. And, there was an interview with him recently in which he was saying that if Ford were to respect the demands of the UAW, they would go bankrupt. And he was basically saying that, they would have to pay out something like $300,000 per worker a year if they were to respect or follow through with these demands. But that is in effect not true, because the demand of $300,000 a year is based on absolute highest tier. And if you were to monetize all of the benefits that workers would be entitled to, so it would only be a fracture of the auto worker population. So that is just, pure lies to say that this is what the workers are really demanding. And in addition to that, the automakers have been making huge profits within the first 6 months of 2023, the big three reported that they made something like 21 billion in profits. So it's just not true that they can't meet the demands of the workers.
Yeah, and I thoroughly agree with what you just said, and I just would add, Sean Fain has, pointed out that the labor costs for the auto companies is 5% for the production of a vehicle. So I think that probably you could look back at the bailout, you could look back at negotiations going way, that always in the middle of the negotiations, there's always a threat about, oh, this is really bad for the industry and we won't be competitive. And these are ways to shape the narrative and try to win the public to, the workers are demanding too much. The UAW's, this is outlandish, and so on. But I think that these are more for media, communications than reality. They use that justification for everything. They use that justification to send all the work to Mexico. Well, we can be more competitive. Well, they're making out like bandits, and that's what the UAW is saying is at some point we got to stop the banditry and reach equity for the workers and working class people.
Yeah, they're saying they need to be more competitive, but in the past year, they've also spent over $5 billion in stock buybacks just to decrease to increase demand of shares and to drive up the share values. So they clearly have money, and the CEOs have been, pocketing all sorts of big profits. But why don't we speak about Mexico? I'm not so familiar with the struggle there, but I know, there were incidents in the early 2000s. I believe that there was like a very tragic incident in Mexico at one of the plants there. And I think the conditions for workers in Mexico have also been pretty terrible.
So I'm glad you brought up Mexico. And by the way, today, Sean Fain in his statement, in his live stream, mentioned that there's been expressions of international solidarity from all over the world, including from Mexico. We can go back depending on how far back in the history, but I can tell you that, for example, in 1890, auto workers in a Cuautitlán assembly plant for Ford waged a militant struggle against a corrupt union, a pro-company union controlled by the government, and in their fight, which included occupation of their factory, they had between Ford, and there was also some AFL-CIO involvement, had 300 goons armed with machine guns and battering rams that went into the factory and shot 9 of the workers. 1 was killed. And those are the kind of conditions that were faced by Ford workers. We fast forward to 2019, a different scenario. This was the GM assembly plant in Silao, where they manufacture trucks. And there, again, workers' militancy, some of the workers started to refuse overtime, mandatory overtime, and started to fight against speed up in support of our strike here at GM, where we had a 40-day strike about many of the same issues that we're fighting for now. And those workers were fired. And they went on to form their own, they kicked out the corrupt union that was in control, and they formed their own independent union. But they get paid a tenth of what U.S. workers get paid. And they did negotiate a contract. They did get some raises, but they need a lot of support from U.S. workers to raise their level to a livable life and livable wage, much in the same way that we're fighting here for the same.
Do you think the big three are scared that the amount of support behind the UAW in the U.S. and the scale of the strikes will inspire workers in Mexico to also go on strike?
It's already happening.
It's already happening.
It's already happening. And there is, I'm happy to report that there are a growing number of UAW members and supporters who are wanting to support and aid workers in Mexico who are also waging this fight. And in fact, one of the leaders of this GM situation in 2019 will be in Detroit this weekend. And he will be meeting up with UAW workers, and they're going to be trading notes and comparing their life experiences and their work experiences. And I see this as growing. And I also, I mean, not only Mexico, but I heard of Canadian workers who have been very inspired by Shawn Fain's live streams and so on. So there's a lot of workers that are looking from different countries and to see what's going on now down here in the U.S. And so I really respect Shawn Fain for the burden that he's taken on in providing this new leadership for the UAW.
Well, that's great to hear. What do you make of the domestic politics in the U.S. at the moment? I mean, Trump has obviously taken advantage of the strike, and he's trying to position himself as someone who is pro-auto worker, but he has a pretty bad track record. So maybe you could speak about his track record. He's said that he's going to go to Detroit next week on September 27th to make an appearance. And so far, the Biden administration hasn't really said that they're going. The spokesperson, Karine Jean-Pierre, she hasn't confirmed or denied that Biden will be making an appearance in Detroit. So it seems like the Biden administration has been caught with, the tail between their legs, so to speak. It's kind of a sad state of affairs, but maybe they're just completely intimidated by Shawn Fain's amazing leadership.
So, yeah, surely Biden would have done himself a favor by doing as Bernie Sanders did, which was he came to Detroit. Bernie Sanders came and addressed a rally of 700 auto workers and supporters, and right in the lead up to the strike. And I think Biden would have been able to do that, could have done that, could still do that. But unfortunately, he's compromised because he was part of the deal of the restructuring. And it's kind of like now he's in a position of having to reverse himself, and the eyes of Wall Street, that don't work. You made a deal and you're going to stick with it. And I think that's why Biden, you haven't seen him. I think, if I was asked, well, what could Biden do for negotiations? He could get about the business of talking about raising the minimum wage and leading a movement in this country. We have not had a raise in the minimum wage in 14 years. And it doesn't matter whether it was a Bush or an Obama or a Trump or a Biden. And it's clear that the entire class of capitalists is quite satisfied with the state of affairs. And it's sort of like holding us down at the same time encouraging. I saw comments from Obama and Biden encouraging our current strike. But as long as you got your foot down on what the minimum wage is, it's kind of hard to go against that. So I think that's what we need. We need a campaign that truly raised the minimum wage after 14 years, certainly in the face of all the inflation that we've been enduring post-pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, Biden just, let the parliamentarian decide on that one. He didn't really seem to care so much about increasing the minimum wage for whatever reason. I mean, he was in a position to actually do something and he didn't, which is, it's pretty regrettable. But, the current state of affairs, my sense is that people who are out striking, they have a lot of energy and motivation, but that they're maybe a bit pessimistic as to the result of all of their efforts. Whereas you grew up being active in the 60s. And I would say that, that particular decade of the 60s was a very, what's the word to use? I mean, it was such a turbulent time. I obviously wasn't around, so I can't speak from experience, but it was a turbulent time, but it was also very inspiring to see all these different movements and people out on the street. So I wonder what your sense is in comparing the current movements today for, the climate, whether it be movements such as Extinction Rebellion, The Last Generation, or the UAW movement compared to a lot of the movements that were going on at the time that you were also involved in, and whether you feel that there's more of a sense of pessimism now compared to back then.
So I'm happy to answer your question, but I don't want to let Trump off the hook.
That's right. We didn't get to Trump. Okay, let's start with Trump first, and then we'll get back to it.
And I think this is very, very important because now we have Trump fishing in troubled waters by coming to Michigan, I think, this coming Wednesday. And but I think he's kind of like dumb as a rock, because what he's done is now attacked the UAW leader who is standing up to the billionaires, Sean Fain, and he thinks that by attacking Sean Fain that he's going to make inroads into the UAW, and I think he's going to be sadly mistaken. On the contrary, but I think it's very important because a lot of there was always this notion that there were a lot of auto workers that supported Trump in 2016. Many of them who had supported Bernie Sanders before that, and I think it's very important to explain how Trump sells this snake oil. And I want to quote from a Detroit News article that was published in 2015, which said, Trump suggested, this is right before he ran for election, suggested one way to stop automakers' expansion to Mexico is by moving some production out of Michigan to lower wage states. So he didn't have a problem with shaming UAW members. And in fact, he said, your U.S. automakers could ship production away from Michigan to communities where auto workers would make less. And quote, you can go to different parts of the United States and then ultimately you do full circle. You'll come back to Michigan because those guys are going to want their jobs back, even if it is less. That's Trump's strategy. And in fact, that's been the strategy of the whole capitalist class. And he's spelling that out. And if anybody thinks that that's worker friendly, you should go back and read the article because it's hostile to our membership. And here he is coming, currying favor with us. It's not going to work. He's a charlatan, and he's trying to fool auto workers into thinking that he's their buddy. He's not. He's their enemy. Now, to go to your question. So the movement in the 60s was definitely, revolution was in the air. We had, in Detroit, we had the League of Revolutionary Black Workers who were shutting down plants, demanding rights and for Black workers in the UAW and in the industry. And there was all this ferment. I mean, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, but there was a level of activity that propelled a lot of us to become activists for a long time. And today, I mean, you're beginning to see this in different instances, especially in the environmental movement. And I noticed that the media, mass media, the corporate media, did not report on the massive demonstration in New York City. I think it was last Sunday. Yeah, and there was not a peep, not even a so-called liberal corporate media. And this is a sign, and I think there were demonstrations in many, many other places. And this is a sign of a rising movement, certainly among young people who are confronted with the existential threat of what is climate catastrophe going to look like to me or to parents with young children. And I think that there is no way around having to build that kind of movement. And I'm glad to see that there's an increasing harmony or homogenizing of interests between the global and the climate catastrophe movement and the UAW. And we had over 100 organizations that are espousing climate change as the issue or social justice issues who come out in support of the UAW strike, and especially in the demand for a just transition now that the UAW are just confronted with all the electrification of the industry and battery production and non-union plants. And I have to say, having been active 50 years now in the labor movement, that the kind of excitement that I'm seeing in the working class, seeing at this rally where Bernie came and Rashida Tlaib and so on, to see the level of excitement and the anger and the hope is really refreshing. And I think that this is a wake up going on in the working class movement. And I think that people should have some enthusiasm about where the direction of this movement, where it's going to go.
Well, you bring up an important point, and that's the issue of electric vehicles. I think the Inflation Reduction Act had provisions in there to support the electric vehicle industry at something like, $9 billion worth of loans. And the UAW workers are not saying that they don't want this just transition to electric vehicles, but what they're concerned about is that they won't have union jobs in, electric vehicle plants. And so they want to ensure that the current levels of employment are maintained and that money is invested in this just transition, because you can't just have a green transition without actually subsidizing it and paying for it and ensuring that workers are able to transition properly from regular auto worker jobs to electric vehicle jobs. So how would you say the media has covered this angle of electric vehicles? Are they trying to paint workers as being opposed to any sort of green transition?
So I want to say, to Sean Payne's credit, to the UAW, they have made it very clear that they're not against the transition to electrification. So there is an understanding and a comprehension that Sean Payne just said a few days ago, that global warming is real. And so, but obviously the companies, as they did with the bailout, they see a moment here where they can take advantage of a situation. Yeah, they're going to go to electrification, but they're going to use this opportunity to once again create another tier of auto workers. And if the Ultium battery plant is any example in Ohio, where we high rate worker, the legacy workers making $32 an hour, they want to bring battery workers in at 21. And this is not setting a good standard for auto workers of the future. Sustaining a $20 wage is not going to cut it. And so, again, the companies to engage in a transition, the working class has to be part of it. It has to be something that workers don't. It's not a win-lose proposition. It's got to be a win-win. Workers want to see a change in regard to ending carbon emissions, but they don't want to do it at the expense of their own livelihoods. And that's awfully reasonable for anybody, and everybody can understand that. And that another thing that Biden can do is ensure that the workers that are brought into the battery plants are commensurate or part of the master UAW agreements with the big three.
Well, Frank Hammer, it was really great to speak to you. And Frank Hammer, you're the former president of the UAW Local 909 in Detroit, and you've had all sorts of experience as an activist as well. So it's really great to have your insights on this historic ongoing UAW strike.
I'm so glad to spend this time with you, and we move on, we go forward. Thank you so very much.
Hope to speak to you again. And thank you so much for watching theAnalysis.news. If you enjoyed this content and would like to donate to the show, please go to our website, theAnalysis.news, and hit the donate button at the top right corner of the screen. You can also subscribe to our podcast on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. And we'll see you next week.